Thank you everybody for coming. We're going to get started. I just want to mention tonight's shiur is dedicated in the memory of Chaim Yitzchak ben Yuta Leah. Tonight is his yard site, the 6th of Av, tonight, tomorrow. So it should be in Leah's Neshama through the
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Again, I'm still a little under the weather. Been not well the entire week, so excuse me if my voice is a little low. Obviously, we normally do the Haftorah, but since the Haftorah is very much linked to the 9th of Av, the Haftorah this Shabbat is, of course, not only is it the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, it actually is the Shabbat of the 9th of Av itself. And the Haftorah that is always read is called the Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah. It is the first parak of Yeshayahu, and it really talks about the moral and spiritual disintegration of the people that will result in exile and churban and estrangement from God. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av generally, and obviously it links to the Haftorah because the Haftorah is about that type of spiritual disintegration. Now, let me start with an observation of Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, a very, very interesting observation. He points out that if you look at the halachot of private mourning and you compare them to the halachot of public mourning, you see an opposite trajectory. In private mourning, we start off at a very, very high and severe level. We first sit Shiva, in which you don't even leave the house. And you're not allowed to do many, many things. You're not allowed to wash and laundry. And then you move into Shloshim, the 23 days, up to 30 days after the Shiva. You can already leave your house. And for most relatives, that is as far as mourning goes. And for a father or a mother, the Torah requires, not the Torah, the rabbis require that the mourning extend for a whole year. But it's much more lenient, meaning avelut of a yachid, avelut of a private nature, starts off min hachamor at a very, very severe level, and it progressively gets easier and easier and easier till eventually you re-enter life. When we talk about the weeks of the year that are devoted to mourning over the Beit HaMikdash, we actually find the opposite type of pattern. We first start off with the 3 weeks. From the 17th of Tammuz, we have certain restrictions. And actually, according to the law of the Gemara, there are virtually no restrictions. But the minhag, at least among Ashkenazim, that's developed is that we don't get haircuts, we don't make weddings, we don't listen to music. And then you get to Rosh Chodesh Av, where Chazal say, Mishenichnas Av, once the month of Av begins, Mima'atin b'simcha, we diminish our joy. And this is the famous 9 days where, again, Ashkenazim are stricter than Sephardim in this. Perhaps it's the Mediterranean temperament. Actually, Rabbi Mark Angel wrote a whole book about the Sephardic tendency in halacha. But be it as it may, at least for Ashkenazim, the 9 days is a very, very severe. You don't bathe, you don't do laundry, etc. And then we get to the week of Tisha B'Av. Now, this year, interestingly enough, whenever Tisha B'Av is observed on a Sunday, whether the Sunday is the 9th of Av or whether the Sunday is the 10th of Av, there is no week preceding Tisha B'Av. So if Tisha B'Av would be on a Wednesday, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday would have certain chumrot called Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av. This week, there is no Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av because Tisha B'Av is going to be observed on a Sunday. But for most people, Shavua Shechal Bo is not different than the 9 days themselves, but for Sephardim it makes a big difference because Sephardim do begin to observe the restrictions that Ashkenazim keep during the 9 days in the Shavua Shechal Bo Tisha B'Av, which means this year they get a freebie. They don't have any of those restrictions. But be it as it may, Shavua Shechal Bo is stricter than the 9 days, and then there's Erev Tisha B'Av, and then there's the crescendo, the ultimate Avelut, which is Tisha B'Av. So you see, it's an opposite direction. For private Avelut, you start in a very strict way, and you go downhill, getting more and more lenient. For public Avelut, you start light, and you move to greater and greater chumrot. And Rav Soloveitchik explained that this is because the psychological function of the mourning rituals are opposite purposes. With private mourning, a person's life is shattered. A person loses a spouse, a parent, God forbid, a child, a sibling. they are overwhelmed with grief. They don't feel that they can actually go on. The grief can destroy them. So Avelut creates a psychological mechanism of healing that will eventually allow you to re-enter and to readjust to ordinary life. So for the first 7 days, don't leave the house. People come to you. They build you up. They give you strength. Then after 7 days, you're able to make your first tentative steps outside liat liat. You don't yet go to weddings. After 30 days, perhaps you can go to weddings already and the like. Because the whole function of Avelut is to create an inner healing. I still remember very, very vividly. This is when I first became a rabbi in Silver Spring in 1988. And this is actually even before I became a rabbi. I was already hired, but I wasn't there yet. And unfortunately, a member of my show, or a member of my future to be show, lost a child that he had had from a prior non-Jewish spouse. And the child converted, and etc. And they were divorced, and he was already remarried to a Jewish woman. And I still remember very, very vividly that, obviously it's always a little awkward when a divorced couple loses a child, but it's definitionally a very, very awkward situation. But I remember how the Jewish man, the Jewish father, was surrounded and protected and comforted by all of these rituals and all of these halachot. And I still remember my heart was very, very breaking about the mother, who was not Jewish, who did not have this particular support system. We don't realize, or anyone that's gone through it actually does realize, the remarkable psychological healing of something like Shiva. And in fact, sometimes Shiva is not observed. If, for example, a Yom Tov intervenes, if a funeral is, for example, Erev Chag, there literally is no Shiva. You only observe Shiva until the Yom Tov, and that's it. And people have told me afterwards how difficult it was that they didn't have that experience of Shiva. So one of the purposes, not the only purpose, but one of the purposes of Avelut is to bring you back to ordinary life. So you're able to have a certain amount of healing and a certain amount of normalcy. So as a result, you understand that the trajectory of Avelut will start off very, very strict, and it gradually eases off so you'll be able to re-enter life. With the Chorban Beit HaMikdash, it's exactly the opposite. How many of us are so broken over the destruction of the temple that we can't function? How many of us say, I just cannot get up today because not having the Beit HaMikdash, not having the Shekhinah is destroying me? Our problem is not that we're so overwhelmed with grief that we can't function and we need some type of re-entry program. It's the other way around. We don't even know what it is that we're supposed to be crying about. We never had a Beit HaMikdash. And again, obviously the Beit HaMikdash is not about a fancy building. We have fancy buildings. We have architecture that might rival the Beit HaMikdash in its physical beauty, although the Beit HaMikdash of Herod was quite a beautiful structure. But the Beit HaMikdash is symbolic of a certain relationship with God, a certain level of holiness, a certain closeness, a connection that we can have with each other and with the Ribono Shel Olam. And just as a blind person who never had vision cannot really understand color, and a person that was born deaf cannot truly understand music. So we really don't know. We really don't know what it is that we're missing, what it is that we're praying for. You may remember a very famous story from the Six-Day War, that when the IDF finally captured the old city and they arrived at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. So the religious Chayolim were praying and crying, and they were overwhelmed with emotion. And there was a secular soldier, Chiloni, who was not observant of Judaism at all. And he was crying as well. And when some of his colleagues said, "What are you crying for? You don't even know what this is." He says, "I'm crying because I don't know why they're crying. And I see that there's something I'm missing." In reality, the story of that Chiloni is the story of us. This is not an us-them type of situation. And that is, we should really cry on Tisha B'Av because we simply don't know what it is that we're supposed to be crying about. And therefore, Rav Soloveitchik says that the purpose of the mourning rituals is not to take you out of grief, but to move you into grief. That somehow maybe there's a sense that by externally going through motions of bereavement and sorrow, perhaps the external act may cause me to internalize certain feelings that he otherwise wouldn't have. So it's quite logical, it's eminently logical, that you start off light and you move to a crescendo because we're moving you into grief, not away from grief. Because in private mourning, grief is the norm from which I need to extricate myself. Public mourning, grief is the matzav that I need to get to, because naturally it is not in my heart and it's not in my soul. Now you know that after the 6-Day War, there was a discussion even in religious circles about reforming the Tisha B'Av liturgy, because the prayer that is besides the kinot, but in the Amidah for Mincha, we have a paragraph called Nachem. We ask God to comfort the mourners of Yerushalayim, and it uses expressions about Jerusalem that some people feel don't really apply today. Have mercy on the abandoned, burnt, destroyed, desolate, humiliated city. So some people felt, again, even within religious circles, they were discussing, that's not our situation. I mean, Baruch Hashem, Yerushalayim is united, not totally united, but the old city and the rest of the city, and Jews are flourishing, and we're the startup nation, and all many good things. The growth of Torah as well, maybe especially the growth of Torah learning. So, granted, we don't have Mashiach, we don't have Beit HaMikdash, but how can you talk about Yerushalayim as Chareva, Shomeima, Bizuya? Is that really true? But the answer is, in some ways, living in Yerushalayim, you might be able to feel the pain of Galut even more so than in the Galut. You walk by the Har HaBayit, whether you halachically take the position that you're allowed to go in the Har HaBayit, or whether you halachically you can't go in the Har HaBayit. But everyone realizes that if you're on the Har HaBayit and you say a bracha on a glass of water, the police are going to arrest you. It is against the law. It is against Israeli law to pray, Jewish prayer at least. The other people are able to, but it is forbidden for a Jew to pray on the Har HaBayit. Right? You'll be arrested. And you see that we still live in a state of war, a state of terror, and of course the Sinat Chinam within the Jewish people is so devastating. Chazal say that the Second Temple was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. And Josephus records. Josephus, a bit of a controversial figure, Yosef ben Matisyahu, very interesting person. Some consider him the Benedict Arnold of the Jewish people. Josephus was, of course, a general in the Jewish army during the war against Rome, and he basically surrendered. Although it's interesting that in many ways, Josephus had a very similar hashkafa to the sages, to Chazal, who also were very much against military struggle against Rome. So actually Josephus might have been more of the rabbinic position. But Josephus did spend the bulk of the war after his surrender in Rome, but he was an eyewitness from the Roman side to many of the activities connected to Titus's destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And his history of the Jewish war is still a very primary source for that war. But obviously, you have to take everything Josephus says with a tremendous grain of salt, because he was writing under the protection of Titus. So he couldn't discredit the Romans. He couldn't describe them as monsters, etc. But he, within his very difficult position, he tried to elevate the Jewish people as well, showing that they were a noble people, etc. So he records a conversation that Titus had with one of his generals. And to me it rings true because it actually fits what Chazal said. At some point, Titus was musing that perhaps he doesn't have to destroy the Beit HaMikdash or destroy Jerusalem, because he said, if if I just leave these people alone, in a few months they will destroy it on their own. And Josephus describes, this tells you Sinat Chinam didn't just mean people didn't like each other. He actually describes the warring factions of Jews, different parties of zealots trying to take over the city. And he describes, while the temple was still up, that there were two sides, on opposite sides of the courtyard of the temple, that were shooting arrows at each other. And the Kohanim were ducking the arrows to bring the korbanot. This is a scene that he actually describes in the Beit HaMikdash itself. So that was then. But Chazal have a very important teaching. Chazal say, any generation in which the Beit HaMikdash is not rebuilt is as guilty as the generation of the Churban itself. This is an extraordinarily important teaching, because what this is saying is, don't understand the Gemara as saying, they were guilty of Sinat Chinam, and we haven't gotten the temple back because of what they did. That's not the way it works. If we would not be guilty of those very same Aveirot, we would have the Beit HaMikdash back. So, if Chazal say the Bayit Sheni was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, then definitionally, if we have not gotten the Beit HaMikdash back, we are guilty of Sinat Chinam. Now, the truth of the matter is, I don't think I need to prove this with any level of sophistication, because it's quite obvious that the Jewish world is beset with Sinat Chinam on all levels, whether it's religious, secular, whether it's conservative, Reform, Orthodox, whether, and this is even most distressing, the tremendous number of divisions that exist within Jews that are committed to Torah and mitzvot. The fact that, I'll give you one minor example, but it's a striking example. There were two kindergartens that were adjacent to each other. I'm not sure if one was secular and one was religious, or one might have been Haredi and one Dati Leumi. I'm not even sure. And what happened was, during recess, children were communicating to each other through the chain link fence that separated the two playgrounds. So somebody decided, I don't know who decided, that there needed to be a black tarp placed over the chain link fence so there could be no communication, huh?
Sick.
Well, this is what it is. But this is the norm. This is the norm. And indeed, as a rabbi, I get shilas all sorts of times. Oh, my neighbor is so-and-so. How can I let my kid? I mean, these are common types of questions that people are asking all the time. We can't talk to them. We can't interact, whoever the them is. I'm not identifying a them here. We can't talk to them. We can't interact with them. They will be a bad influence one way or the other. This is Sinat Chinam. Now, if a person says in their defense, "Oh, it's not Chinam, I have a good reason." Well, listen, nobody hates unless they say they have a reason. Right? I mean, somebody says, "I'm against hating people for no reason," but anybody I hate, I have a good reason. Obviously, Chazal consider whatever reason you have not to be a good reason, meaning it's still called Chinam. And hatred is not only about throwing stones. It's about coldness, indifference, cliquishness. The concept that I have my group and you have your group. And what happens to your group, the division of the Jewish world into an us and a them. Again, whoever the us and the them is. I don't intend to, designate any particular group. But the concept of we have ours, us, and there's a them. And what happens to the them is of no concern to us. Everyone knows a famous parable of the Talmud Yerushalmi. It's as if people are on a boat, and under my seat there's a hole that springs water, and when you try to fix it, they say, "Get out of here, it's my business, there's a hole that's under my seat." But the answer is, if the water comes in, everybody sinks. If any Jews are in trouble, we're all in trouble. And only by achdus and by love and by care and by concern can we rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So again, this doesn't need a lot of proof, and it's not even anything. I mean, we need to talk about it a lot just to raise, just to be sure it's in our minds, but intellectually, all of us know that the Jewish world is beset with Sinat Chinam on all sorts of levels. And it's really such a tragedy because so much of the world already hates us. And so much of the world wants to destroy us. So, we need to be our enemy as well. It's something that's very, very tragic in many, many ways. But what I want to talk about tonight is really a part of the Gemara that is often not discussed. I want to go back to the first temple, all the way back to the first Beit HaMikdash that was destroyed. Again, this is also an interesting historical problem. The second Beit HaMikdash, we kind of know when it was destroyed, although it's still a range of years. It was destroyed between the years 68 and 70. 70 is the most common year. Sometimes people give 68, 69. The first Beit HaMikdash is actually quite interesting. There's a major chronological controversy about the year of the first Beit HaMikdash. If you open up any world history, the year that will be given for Nebuchadnezzar's Churban of the Temple of Solomon, of Shlomo HaMelech in Yerushalayim, is said to be 586 BCE. Now the problem is that is inconsistent with the Jewish reckoning of time for the following reason. Chazal had a Masorah that between the Churban Beit HaMikdash Rishon and the Churban Beit HaMikdash Sheni is 490 years, because there were 70 years of the Babylonian exile, and the Bayit Sheni, from the time it was built till the Churban, is 420. So therefore, from Churban Bayit Rishon to Churban Bayit Sheni is 490 years. That's rabbinic chronology. And this is actually based on an interpretation of one of the visions that Daniel had when God decreed 70 weeks, a week, and that must mean 7 years. There'll be 70 groups of 7 years until there will be the Churban, and that adds up to 490. Now the problem is very, very clear. Between 586 BCE and 70 CE is more than 600 years, as opposed to 490. So you're dealing with 120 years or so. And these are the famous, in Jewish chronology, these are the famous missing years, meaning to say Jewish chronology seems to be around 120 to 150 years short, which means perhaps the Second Temple actually had a longer duration than is normally the case. So the religious historians who try to reconcile secular history with rabbinic chronology have many, many different answers to this. Some say the secular chronology is wrong. Some say the rabbinic chronology is wrong. Some say the rabbis deliberately did not want to count 120 years of the Bayit Sheni. Rav Schwab, for various reasons, Rav Schwab then changed his mind on it, or at least he probably got in trouble. He didn't want to stay with it. So there are literally many, many different answers. Rabbi Beryl Wein in his book has a long footnote on it, and he says he's not going to resolve the contradiction. But be it as it may, whatever the year is, it's not that important for our purposes, but it is a very interesting issue. Chazal tell us that the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, not because of Sinat Chinam, but for the worst Averos in the Torah, the 3 sins for which a person must give up his life. And that is Avodah Zarah, idolatry, Gilui Arayot, sexual immorality, Shvichut Damim, murder. Right? And Chazal make the point, Bo Ra'eh, the first Beis HaMikdash that was destroyed for Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shvichut Damim, the exile only lasted 70 years. The second Beis HaMikdash that was destroyed for Sinat Chinam, we are still in the Galot to this very, very day. So you see what Sinat Chinam is. But going back to the first Beis HaMikdash, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shvichut Damim, what's interesting is when we mourn the Churban Beit HaMikdash, are we mourning only the Bayit Sheni, or are we still mourning the Bayit Rishon? Because one way of looking at it is, well, there's no reason to mourn the Bayit Rishon. We got back the Bayit Sheni, so we're only mourning the Bayit Sheni. And yet, there's an interesting comment of the Rambam in the Perush HaMishnayos. The Rambam says quite an amazing thing. The Rambam says they observed the fast of the 9th of Av, even during the 420 years of the Second Temple. Tisha B'Av was a fast day during the Bayit Sheni. Now, why would you be fast? If Tisha B'Av is a fast commemorating the Churban Beit HaMikdash, why would you be fasting when you have a Beit HaMikdash? Now, there are a few possibilities. Rav Soloveitchik actually suggests that since it was known already that the Second Temple would eventually be destroyed, they didn't know when, but there was a sense that this would not be forever. So Rav Soloveitchik says, an interesting point, Tisha B'Av during the Second Temple was not a mourning observance. It was a prayer that the other shoe shouldn't drop. It was a prayer that God should keep it right. So it's switched. When there's a Churban, we mourn. When there's a Beit HaMikdash, we pray that the temple shouldn't be nechrab. That's Rav Soloveitchik's understanding, that Tisha B'Av in the Bayit Sheni was not a din of Avelut, it was a din of, like Yom Kippur, of doing tshuva and kapara. But the other way of learning, which I think is true as well, is that during the Second Temple, they still mourned the loss of the First Temple, because the Bayit Sheni did not have all of the holiness of the Bayit Rishon. Among other things, there was no prophecy during the Second Temple, except at the very beginning of the Bayit Sheni. You had the last Nevi'im, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. When they died, there was no Nevuah in the Bayit Sheni. Chazal even used the Lashon, there was no Hashra'at Shekhinah in the Bayit Sheni. So as a result, what we are mourning is not just the loss of the Bayit Sheni. We are mourning that we never regained what we had with the Bayit Rishon.
The 10 miracles that they say happened every day, was that only also in Bayit Rishon?
No, that wasn't the Bayit Sheni. So there were obviously there were some manifestations of God, but still it was not the same. Nevuah was a major thing. The Urim V'Tumim that Hashem would prophetically answer various questions was not operative during the Bayit Sheni. So what this suggests, therefore, is the following. When we think about the Aveichot that caused the Churban, we're not only thinking about the Sinat Chinam that caused the Churban of the Bayit Sheni, we're also thinking about Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim that caused the Churban of the Bayit Rishon. So here, I think we immediately have a problem. If the problem is Sinat Chinam, so unfortunately we are cursed with that, and there's plenty to think about. But come on, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim, we're not that bad, meaning we're not worshiping idols. Most people are not Osek and Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim. In other words, the question I want to raise is, I understand the relevance of meditating and resolving to improve in the areas of Sinat Chinam, but what is the relevance of thinking about the original sense of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, Shfichut Damim? Are they really problems that we face? So in reality, they are problems even today, and let me give you a few different possibilities. Possibility number one, and these are going to be interrelated, they're not going to be totally distinct, is Chazal identifying many, many types of Averos as connected to the big three. For example, Chazal say, Kol HaKoes Ki'ilu Oved Avodah Zarah. Anyone that has anger is tantamount to idolatry. Chazal say, Kol HaMalbin Pnei Chaveiro Barabim. If you embarrass a person publicly, Ki'ilu Shofech Damim. It is as if you're a murderer. Chazal also talk about Gadol Hirhure Aveira. If a person has sexual fantasies, that could be as bad or worse than the Aveira itself. So on one level, even if I don't murder people, have I embarrassed people? Even if I don't bow down to an idol, have I been angry and not accepted Hashem's judgments? Have I had fantasies, as the Jimmy Carter used to say, have I committed adultery in my heart? Again, I'm not going to fault him for expressing that sentiment. That is what Chazal call Hirhure Aveira. So, in many, many ways, even if we don't do the actual Avera in a very, very literal sense, but symbolically we're connected to it in various ways. And of course, Avodah Zarah itself can take on all sorts of things. Avodah Zarah, the concept of, why, for example, is anger tantamount to idolatry? So the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman, says it's very much connected. Because if you believe that God runs the world, and if you believe that everything that happens to you is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then what are you angry against? You either reject God, or you believe that God is not in charge of what happens in your life. So that is a form of Avodah Zarah, of not accepting Hashem as the ultimate arbiter of what happens in your life.
And most people get angry because somebody crossed a boundary with them, somebody took advantage of them, hurt them. So,
well, that triggers a huge.
What was the question?
Yeah, the question is that people get angry because people have crossed boundaries, people have abused me in various ways. So the question is that coming from God? That's a huge machlokas. You know, the Chovos HaLevavos writes that although human beings have free will, so God did not make that guy insult you, but if it wouldn't be God's will that you bear that insult, it wouldn't have happened. So in a sense, Hashem is simply utilizing that person's free will to carry out Hashem's gezerah. So the Chovos HaLevavos takes the extreme position, actually, that no person can inflict any type of harm on another person unless it is the will of God. Now, we don't know why God will will it, but that's what the Chovos HaLevavos says. And therefore the Chovos HaLevavos says, although the guy that crossed the boundaries has committed a sin and will be held to account by the Almighty for his free will, but in effect that shouldn't affect you, because it would have happened anyway, if not through him, through somebody else. That is the view of the Chovos HaLevavos, and the Baal HaTanya seems to be following that everything that happens is from Hashem. Now, admittedly, the Or HaChaim does say the opposite. The Or HaChaim says that any injury that is inflicted on you through human choices is not necessarily coming from God, because if God created a world of free will, then definitionally implicit in that concept is that human beings are capable of harming other human beings. In other words, even something like the Holocaust, again, it's not the subject tonight, and that's a vast, difficult subject. But the Holocaust may, according to this view, may not be what God had decreed, but rather, if God creates free will, that enables evil human beings to wreak havoc in the world. So your point is a big controversy in how you understand the interaction between God's divine providence and human autonomy and free will.
in the Kol HaKois, according to the Or HaChaim, how would that work out?
I think you'd have to give another explanation. I'm not sure. I think it would still come out to the idea that one is supposed to look at the difficulties in life, even if they come from human choice, as vehicles of atonement, meaning once a person does suffer, there is atonement of sin. If you don't accept what God allowed to happen, even if God didn't decree it, that's also a rejection of God in some ways. Right, so that's answer number one. So answer number one is, even if I'm not guilty of idolatry, perhaps I'm guilty of anger. And even if I'm not guilty of murder, perhaps I'm guilty of embarrassing people. And even if I'm not guilty of actual adultery, perhaps I had various hirhurei aveira, particularly in a sexually saturated society that bombards you with messages one after a time. Now, let me tell you a story that literally shocked me. Again, maybe it'll be a minor story, but I did not take it minor. And somebody told me that they had gone through a divorce recently. A woman went through a divorce, two religious people. And the father is not quite there, and he went to the school and he complained that his daughter in 7th grade does not show him proper respect, and she wants the teacher to do something about it. Whether the father is right or not, I think makes no difference, as you'll hear in the story. So the teacher announced in school that this young girl does not fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud avim, so nobody should talk to her, because she does not fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud avim. Now, in my opinion, the teacher ought to be fired. What type of teacher publicly humiliates a student, even if the father was 100% correct? The halacha of giving musar, the halacha of giving tochacha, the halacha of giving instruction is you do it privately. You never embarrass a person publicly. That is treated as murder. And this young girl had kids who stopped talking to her because the Morah said, this is not a good girl, you can't talk to her. So this is an example. This is ritzicha. This is murder. Chazal saying, Ma'al b'nei chaver b'Rabbi. Rabbi, I'm sorry, did you want to say something? Yeah. This is considered shvichus damim. And the principal ought to give this teacher two choices. You apologize publicly to the girl, in which case we would accept that tshuva, that'd be fine, or you leave. A teacher cannot be allowed to do this. A parent is not allowed to do it. A parent, of course, is supposed to discipline a child and guide a child. I'm not suggesting your children do things, you don't intervene to instruct them and even punish them. But you don't do it in a way that humiliates. Because what happens simply is, children, what's the saying? People who hurt. A child is humiliated, he'll grow up to be another person who humiliates other people, including their own children. Right? So this is answer number one, that, we are guilty of avodah zarah, geilui shvichus damim, if not in the literal form, in the forms that Chazal correlated to it. Answer number two is the following idea. Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was the Rav of Tzfat in the 1500s, and this was really the glory days of Tzfat. Tzfat was a much bigger Torah center than Yerushalayim in those days, and you had Rav Yosef Karo was the Rav, and he was also a Makubal as well, but you had Rav Moshe Cortevero, who was then Nifter, and then the Arizal came. We just had the Arizal's yortzeit. The Arizal was only in Tzfat for a year and a half, but he made such a tremendous Rosham in Tzfat. Rav Shlomo Alkabetz was the Chazan. Rav Moshe Alshich was the Darshan. You really had the Kedusha there, was on the Mabit. Tremendous, unbelievable Kedusha. So Rav Yosef Karo, it's very interesting Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo himself was a great Makubal. He was a great Makubal. He was already in his 70s when the Arizal came to Tzfat at the age of 37. And Rav Yosef Karo would go to the Arizal to hear Shiurim, but he always fell asleep. So the Ari said, it was Nigzar in Shemayim that I should not be your Rebbe. Because of your greatness, it would not be proper for me to be your Rebbe, so Hashem didn't want you to hear Kabbalah from me. But Rav Yosef Karo did have even a better source, maybe even than the Ari. Rav Yosef Karo had a malach that he would learn with. And this was called his Magid, his preacher. And Rav Yosef Karo has left us a diary of his learning with the malach. This is a sefer that is called Magid Meisharim. I believe you can even look at it for free on HebrewBooks.org. Magid Meisharim. So in the Magid Meisharim, Rav Yosef Karo has the following diary entry. That he gives the story that one time he was trying to understand a very difficult piece of the Gemara, and he worked hard on it, and he was miyageya for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally he had clarity, and finally he had pshat. So he was very, very happy. So he's walking in Tzfat, and again, if you've been there, you can imagine the narrow alleyways of the Jewish quarter of Tzfat. And he overhears a shoemaker learning that same Gemara with his 8-year-old son. And strangely enough, the 8-year-old son asks his father the same question that bothered Rav Yosef Karo. So I assume Rav Yosef Karo didn't want to eavesdrop, but he was just curious at that point. And the shoemaker was annoyed at his 8-year-old son. He says, I knew this was too hard for you, and why can't you grasp an elementary point? And he says over the pshat that it took Rav Yosef Karo, the Gadol Hador, weeks and weeks to try to understand. And apparently it was so obvious and so simple that the father is annoyed that the 8-year-old didn't get it. So it must have been pretty simple. Even if the 8-year-old was obviously very bright, but still, if the father's saying, why don't you understand this? It's A, B, and C. So Rav Yosef Karo figured that he must have been guilty of some tremendous aveira that Hashem withheld from him, something that was so obvious that even an 8-year-old should have gotten it. So he asks his angel, he asks his Maggid, Ma chatati, what is my sin? Why couldn't I understand something that is so obvious and clear? And he records that the angel told him the following idea. He says, your understanding was deep and profound, and the world was not deserving of it. But through your work and through your effort, you brought it into the world. And once you brought it into the world, it becomes like low-hanging fruit, then anybody could get it now. But without your work, it wouldn't have been in the world. You actually find a similar concept even in scientific discoveries. There's a certain time when the world is ready. Like, for example, calculus was discovered at the same time, Leibniz and Newton. There's still a machlokas who gets credit for calculus. Who should the high school seniors hate, and the like. And even relativity, they say Einstein, if Einstein wouldn't have discovered theories of relativity, it would have come down the pike. The world was ready for it. But if we look at this from a spiritual sense, what the Malach told Rav Yosef Karo actually makes no sense. Because what do you mean you brought it into the world? You didn't teach anybody. You didn't communicate it. You didn't explain it. All you did was think it through, and it's in your brain. In what way does that somehow mean everybody can now get a hold of it? So you see here a mystical idea that when a person, through their own avodas Hashem, brings Torah and mitzvos into the world itself gets elevated. People say, oh, you're sitting alone and you're learning Torah, you're davening, what are you doing for the world? You're bringing all sorts of powers into the world. That somehow the Yegiya, the Amelut in Torah, that you yourself are doing in the privacy of your room, somehow can elevate the world in all sorts of imperceptible ways. The Chafetz Chaim used to say, much later, that the intensity of learning in the little village of Radin affects the tzniut of the fashions in Paris. You look at it like an atom bomb, and that is, there's ground zero. Then progressively there'll be waves of radiation that may get weaker and weaker and more attenuated, but the radiation can go for thousands and thousands of miles. So too, ground zero is the yeshiva of Radin, that little village in Poland where people are learning with great intensity. But that will create waves of Kedusha that raise the world. So by the time it gets to Paris, maybe you won't have people learning Torah because of that, but the skirts might be a quarter of an inch lower as a result. Now, what that means, therefore, is the converse is also true. And that is, when we don't create all of the Kedusha we're capable of creating, then the world will be diminished in various ways. So the old anti-Semitic argument that Jews are responsible for everything, I hate to agree with them, but in many, many ways they happen to be correct. Don't tell anybody. And that is, we believe that our Torah and our mitzvot can change the whole world for better. And conversely, when the world is not changed for better, we bear a certain share of negative responsibility for that. So, avodah zarah gila raya shvichas damim, right? The question I wanted to raise is, hey, maybe I'm guilty of sinat chinam, I'll plead guilty to that, but I'm not guilty of avodah zarah gila raya shvichas damim. But here's the thing, even if I myself or you, none of us have done those things, we certainly live in a world. Well, gila raya shvichas damim is obvious. We live in a world of rampant sexual immorality on all levels. We live in a world of violence. We live in a world of murder. We live in a world of people being tortured. We live in a world where these things happen. And if we say, yeah, but it's not me, Well, the answer is maybe it is me, meaning to say, maybe if I would have lived a holier life, I would have been a better person, and enough of us would have done that. The world itself might be affected. You see, the idea that the Jew is an Or LaGoyim, a light to the nations, has never meant, first of all, it's obvious, it has never meant proselytization. Right? The role of the Jew is not to proselytize and try to make other people Jewish. It's the other way around. Somebody wants to be Jewish. Initially, we are supposed to discourage them and talk about other avenues. So, but Or LaGoyim is primarily in the way we live our lives, with morality, with goodness, with Kiddush Hashem. I'm not saying we do that, but the ideal is that we do that, and it has an influence on the world. So therefore, my second answer to Avodah Zarah Gilei Shvichas Damim is that even if I'm not guilty on my own, if I live in a world where that exists, and Avodah Zarah, I would also say exists, besides Hinduism, actual idolatry. But as I say, Avodah Zarah can be anything that becomes the central meaning of your existence other than God. So Avodah Zarah can mean money, it can mean power, it can mean control, it can mean careerism, whatever it is, any ideology that dominates your life and becomes the central meaning of your life, other than the service of Hashem in accordance with His will, becomes Avodah Zarah. So there is plenty of Avodah Zarah in the world in that sense. So consequently, the idea is that if I live in a world that is shakua in Avodah Zarah, Gilui Araya, Shvichas Damim, then I, to some degree, am guilty for what is going on. Okay, so Jews are guilty for a lot of things. You know, they have, one of the survival mechanisms that Jews have developed over the centuries of persecution is the sense of humor. And I feel very uneasy by telling you a Holocaust joke. But the only reason I'm going to tell you a Holocaust joke is because it was said by people during the Holocaust, meaning it's not my joke, but just to show you that Yidden, even during the Holocaust, tried to see things in a humorous way because it gave them chizuk. Now this was in the early years of Hitler, 1933-34, the Nuremberg laws, the various discriminatory laws against Jews. So the story goes that two Jews were on a bus, and they already had to wear the yellow star. And one of the Jews is reading the notorious Nazi paper, Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher, which was a rabidly evil anti-Semitic paper. So one Jew says to the other Jew, he says, how can you possibly read that? He says, listen, times are very tough. We're losing our jobs. We're losing our property. We're losing our houses. We can't immigrate. Our money is being confiscated. Things are very bad. So I pick up this newspaper and I see Jews control the banking, Jews control the wealth. He says, I want to get a little bit of good news once in a while. He says, so that was the idea. So Jews control things, but they don't control necessarily physical things, but the spiritual keys of the world. Klal Yisrael has great power. I'm sorry, you were saying?
No, it's interesting. Victor Frankl talks about in his book that in the camps itself they used humor.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Humor is a wonderful coping and survival mechanism, and it gives a person the ability to see the bright side in things, the ludicrousness of life.
In fact, that most Jews today are secular. Isn't secularism a form of idolatry?
That's correct. That's correct. But of course, secularism needs a definition, like what are you committed to? But everybody has some core of commitment, and if they don't, they're really in trouble. And that becomes Avodah Zarah, because it is service of something other than God. So that would be answer number two. Mm-hmm. Answer number three, again, this is not totally distinct, is offered by Rav Tzadok of Lublin. And Rav Tzadok of Lublin says, Avodah Zarah Gilui Araya Shvichut Damim are obviously behaviors that are the lowest, worst behaviors in God's Torah, but they are not just negative behaviors, they are symptoms of deep character flaws. So as a result, even if I am not guilty of the symptom, I can be guilty of the character flaw which gives rise to the symptom. And in particular, he identifies the three cancers of the human personality, based on Pirkei Avot, kina, tava, v'kavod, right? Rabbi Elazar HaKapor says, hakina v'atava v'kavod, motzian es ha'adam min ha'olam. Kina is jealousy, tava is lust for the hedonistic pleasures of the world in an excessive way, and kavod is a desire for glory and ego gratification. These are motzi es ha'adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of the world. They destroy his world. Olam haba, and even olam hazeh becomes a very, very frustrating life. So here's what Rav Tzadok wants to say. Rav Tzadok wants to say, kina, jealousy, when taken to an extreme, gives rise to murder, which actually is empirically true. You know, most murders outside of terrorist situations, let's say go back to the United States, are really various rivalries, whether it's gang rivalries or family rivalries. They are literally jealousy. They could be over something as seemingly trivial and stupid as, you know, you have a coat that I want, you have sneakers. I mean, their gang killings are over this all the time. So the shorish of kina, in which I deny your legitimacy of whatever attainments you have, I want it for myself, could, God forbid, lead in an extreme case to ritzicha. So shvichus damim is connected to kina. Gilui arayot is, of course, an expression of taiva, of lust. And avodah zarah is connected to kavod because, again, going back with the idea that when you replace the worship of God with self-worship, your power, your money, egocentric, you become your own God. And therefore, Rav Tzadok's argument is that even if I am not guilty of the symptoms of avodah zarah, gilui shvichus damim, the shirashim of kina, tava, v'kavod are very much present in our personalities. And therefore, the 9th of Av is when we try to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Again, as I said last week, just to repeat it, all of us have a job to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. But the way we rebuild the Beit HaMikdash is not by bombing the mosques and physically doing a building. That is the role of Mashiach. That is not our role. But the way we build the Beit HaMikdash is by making our heart and our soul a place where Hashem's presence can reside. As the Pasuk says by the Mishkan, V'yasu li mikdash, make for me a mikdash, a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'tocham, so I will dwell in them. Meaning it's not in the building, it's in us. When the mikdash, when the Shekhinah can dwell within us, then we're zocha to that building that symbolizes that resting of the Shekhinah. So therefore, our Tisha B'Av is really a day of reflection in which we ask ourselves, how do we rebuild the Beit HaMikdash in the way we live in our hearts and in our souls? Let me just end with, a Tisha B'Av morning, we have these prayers that are very, very difficult prayers, the keynote, the lamentation prayers, and a little commercial, at least Or Sameach, where I teach, we have a keynote service that lasts for around 3 hours. I'll be doing around 15. There are a total of 45 keynotes. We do around 15 of them with commentary and the like. I think it starts 9:30, meaning after davening is 9:30 to 12:30.
Just men or women are invited?
No, women are invited too. There's an Ezras Nashim and Or Sameach.
Main base members?
Yeah, main base members. Yeah. So it's a keynote service. I think they put it on YouTube afterwards. How's it again? Yeah. But be it as it may, the keynotes are very, very difficult. But the very last keynote, not the very last, but the next to the last keynote, is the one keynote where we stand up and we actually put it to music. That is Eli Tzion V'Areha. And Eli does not mean Hashem. It's not Keli. It's I once heard a person say Keli. No. Eli is a word lament. Eli Tzion, right? A lament for Zion and her cities. And it's a very heartbreaking type of tune. Eli Tzion, and it's it just reminds a person of the heartbreak of Jewish history and the sufferings of Am Yisrael and the sufferings of God when he sees his nation suffer and his Shekhinah is not in the world. But it's very, very interesting. 2 points about this. It says one should lament for Tzion like a woman who is going through labor pains, and like a young wife who is crying over the husband that has left her. So I would like to suggest that these two mishalim are very, very important here, because we feel like a widow. We feel like our husband has died. We feel like our husband has left us, no longer here. That's the sense of hopelessness that a person could have. But in reality, what the Paitan is suggesting is the perception of widowhood is the wrong analogy. The true analogy is the woman going through the labor pains, where out of the pain and out of the suffering comes new life and new growth and new birth. So on one hand, Yirmiyahu, at the beginning of Eicha, who is describing the nadir of the suffering, Eicha Yashva Vadad Haisa Kalmana. How is the city sitting so bereft like a widow? Because that's how we felt. But in reality, all of that pain is the pain of the mother that is going to give birth. The pain is not the pain of the unending suffering of bereavement, but it's the pain that will come to new life and new redemption. And this is why Rav Soloveitchik says, this is why we stand up when we say Eliseo. Because standing upright, most of the keynotes we say sitting down on the ground or a very low bench, and that represents bereavement. Here we're ready to get up. We're ready to go back to life. We're getting up. But there's an important point. When you get up, remember the Beis HaMikdash even when you get up. Don't think, oh, I finished the morning, now I go back to my regular life. You have to take the Avelut with you. And that is why it is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch that a person should feel the pain of the Beit HaMikdash every single day. In fact, they tell the story, there is in the Siddur, very few people say it, but some Siddurim have it, Tikkun Chatzot. What is Tikkun Chatzot? That there were righteous people, there are some people who still do it. They get up midnight, or they didn't go to sleep yet, and they say prayers every night over the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Some B'davka do it during the 3 weeks, some do it during the 9 days, but the original ritual was literally every night, Tikkun Chatzot. In fact, Breslov pushes it. So they have a kuntras that's called the sweetest hour. They talk about the Tikkun Chatzot. So Rebellia Lapyan, who was a great, great Baal Musar, started doing Tikkun Chatzot when he was in his 80s. So somebody said, why are you starting this now? So he says, well, after a person dies, they test the person if he kept all of the halachos. So they go through the whole Shulchan Aruch page by page by page by page. So listen, Rebellia said, if I didn't keep something that's on page 455, by that time I've already had a track record. But Tikkun Chatzot is actually mentioned page 1 of the Shulchan Aruch. He says, if they already got me on page 1, he says, I'm going to be in trouble. So I want to be sure I do the page 1 things. But still, for most of us, Tikkun Chatzot is not necessarily something we're physically able to do. But the concept of working to create a Beit HaMikdash is something that's very, very worthy of us. And the way we do it is by to try to make our heart and our soul a place where God's presence can reside. So B'ezrat Hashem, we still have a chance that even this year, Tisha B'Av will turn into a day of sason v'simcha. But if Chas v'Shalom, there has to be a fast even this year, may it in fact be the last night of Av that we keep as a Tanit.
Amen.
Okay.
Yiboneh Archives,